Hey everybody, Yankee here. Yesterday I did a video where I talked about the possible role of state governments in maintaining a functional militia. Well, not a lot of people watched that video, but it sure did tick off a lot of people. They sent me a lot of angry emails, mostly from the Left-Tards who don't like the Second Amendment and want to twist what it means. They sent me emails gloating saying, you just admitted you got to be in a militia. If you want to have Second Amendment rights, you got to be in a militia. You also just admitted that the militia needs to be regulated by the government, which I didn't admit any of those things. If I had said those things, it wouldn't be an admission. It'd be a lie because they're not true. One person even said, because of your reasoning about it's a militia that's important and that it needs to be regulated, the fact now that we have a standing army, that replaces the militia, meaning no one is in a militia and no one has Second Amendment rights, which is also crap and the biggest leap of anti-logic I've ever seen. Because if you know anything about history, the Founding Fathers knew we would someday have a standing army. They didn't want to have standing armies, but they knew we would, and they addressed that. Just like they addressed gun rights in the Second Amendment. So let's talk about what the Second Amendment actually says. And how does that relate to a militia? And what is a militia? And do armies replace militias? Because I got emails also from people on the pro-gun side saying, how do I explain those things? How do I explain what the Second Amendment says? How do I explain what a militia actually is? And how do I explain that armies don't replace them? Well, it's all about history, and it's about what the Founding Fathers wrote. So let's look at the Second Amendment itself right here and go over what it means. What does it actually say? And I'm going to read it verbatim here. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Now, does that say you have to be in the militia to be armed? That you only have rights to be armed if you're in a militia? No, it doesn't say that at all. If they wanted to say that, they would say, since a militia is important, no member of a militia shall be denied the right to keep arms. They wouldn't even need to bear them if they were just a militia because they would only need to be there when they got called up. So that's what they would have written if that's what they meant. They didn't mean that. That is a qualifier. That part about the militia, that's a qualifier. That's saying why this part down here is so true. Here's a good reason why this is true. The actual action in that is that the rights of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now that comma might throw some people, but only if you don't understand history, because Thomas Jefferson actually put forward a second version of the Second Amendment that did not have the comma because he said it was grammatically incorrect. It was a mistake, a typo, so to say. I don't think that word existed back then. But he put forward the proper wording, but for some reason, historians say probably a mistake. The original text got ratified, not the correction, but the correction is still on record of what he wanted it to say actually. But even with or without the comma, it's still the same thing. It's just a qualifier and then an action. And that's just words that I'm using to try to explain to you what they mean. I'm not getting into an actual English lesson here. So the first part of that statement qualifies what they're saying next and why it's so important. The right of the people. And remember, this is in the Bill of Rights. A list of individual rights for people. There's no collective rights or conditional rights in there. They're all just individual rights. And this idea that this is the only exception in the Bill of Rights is ridiculous. It has no historical merit whatsoever, that argument. So that's just something that's just silly. So I'm not even going to talk about that. But like I said, this is just saying because of this, this is true. Just like if you said, because for economies to flourish, people need to be able to move around freely. Therefore, the government shall not pose any restrictions on the rights of free people to travel around in public. Now, would that mean you can only move around in public if you're engaging in commerce, if you're supporting the economy, buying something, selling something? No, it wouldn't mean that at all. It would say it just means because, it's necessary for the economy to flourish, to people to be able to travel around, buy things, sell things, transport goods. The government shall not restrict your right to do so, to move around. Doesn't say will not restrict your right to buy or sell goods or to further the economy. You will be able to move around freely in public. You can go on hikes. You can walk around your neighborhood. That's what it means. That's what the Second Amendment means. It's just a qualifier and then an action. In the second example I gave, the action is your rights to move around freely in public shall not be infringed on by the government. In the first one, it's just your right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed on by the government. No one would make the argument that that second statement there meant that you could only go outside if you were buying something. No one would even try to make that. They would just say, this is your right, and this is one of the reasons why it's very important. So the Second Amendment clearly gives every individual the right to keep and bear arms. Now, let's talk about militias, what they really are. And are you in a militia? Well, in most states, if you're between a certain age, usually 16 and 50, because you got to remember back then, 16-year-olds probably were almost grandparents, and 50-year-olds were usually dead because you usually got a splinter around 35 and dropped over dead. So that's a pretty good wide range for them. Now, I technically, by those standards, would be out of the militia. But let's just look at that. What is a militia? A militia is not regulated. Now, the government said the states have the right to call up a militia from the body of the people, but it doesn't say in any way that they have a right to regulate those people. Well regulated, back in the day, just meant functional. It works. That was common vernacular back in the day, well regulated. That doesn't mean the government has any means to control these people when they're not actively participating in the militia. They can't require them to be conscripted or to practice or to show up at certain places at certain times and do things that aren't actually active actions of a militia. Can't do any of that because the whole point of the militia is it's just the citizenry that are not conscripted. And that very thing that they're not conscripted means that they are not subject to regulation of that type. Just the actual vernacular of the time, which just meant functional. And that would just mean they have to be able to have the tools they need and they have to be able-bodied. So you can't prevent them from having the tools. That was the only thing that the Second Amendment the founders were worried about, is that they have the tools and that the state is the one that calls them up, not the federal government, which is why a lot of people don't think the draft is constitutional, because the federal government shouldn't be able to conscript people, period. But that's a different topic. So that whole notion that, you got to be in a militia, and militias are highly regulated things, highly, controlled. That's just not true. That's the opposite. Militias are the opposite of that. They're just ordinary citizens that can be called up, and by the definitions, to stand with and supplement a standing army, to fight against a standing army, or take the place of a standing army. So they are also not replaced by standing armies. Even in the definition, it says they're there to supplement or fight against the standing army or replace them. So the whole notion that armies replace us is stupid. And even if you look at the founders' writings, that whole notion that armies replace militias is stupid. Because the founding fathers knew that someday they would probably have militias. They made lots of statements about people shouldn't be disarmed. George Mason says the quickest way to enslave people is disarm them. Jefferson said disarming people only serves criminals' needs. And I'm paraphrasing all these. And he said no free citizen should ever be denied the right to keep and bear arms. All of those things. There's tons of statements like that that are outside of any type of militia reference whatsoever, just being a free person. But also, if you look at the idea of standing armies, they didn't want standing armies. But they knew someday they would probably exist. As the country grew, they would have an army just like England does. But they said that standing armies, and this is something Hamilton said, if you remember Hamilton, he's a very famous rapper, I assume, from recent things. He said that when you have a standing army is when you more need armed citizens who can form a militia, because they need to be able to resist that standing army. Another person, and I blank on who it is right now, another founding father said that, if ever there's a standing army that outnumbers and overpowers the armed citizenry, that's tyranny. Meaning that by sheer numbers alone, the people should have the ability to overcome a standing army, if one ever exists. So clearly they're not being replaced by, being made more important by. Noah Webster even said, and I think everybody knows Noah Webster, said that before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed. Meaning you have to take away the militia's rights and the individual rights of people to keep and bear arms before the government can rule with a standing army. So it's very clear throughout history that, one, the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right, that the armies do not replace militias. They make militias more important, and militias are not controlled by the state. The state only gets to set the parameter so that you're in the militia. Hey, I'm between 16 and 50. I'm in the militia. And I have a right to keep and bear arms, so I should probably keep some arms and be practiced with them in case I'm ever called up. That's Americana 101. That's all the states have a role in the militia. So they are not something controlled by the government. Like I said, they are non-conscripted citizens. That is the opposite of controlled and regulated in the modern term by the government. The exact opposite. It's the antithesis, like I said. Also, it is an individual right, so no question about that there. And armies did not replace militias, they just make them even more important.